Welcome to Believing the Real, a series of talks on the theology of the real. And in this episode, chapter 12 of our investigation of the theology of the real, we will discuss the rise of professional science as a new mode of achieving truth, which becomes the basis of a global human civilization as the products and conclusions of science are accepted worldwide by all human civilizations, all human cultures. Hello, welcome to another episode of Believing the Real, the turn to the real with the rise of science, which we are now discussing within the context of how, in fact, the shift came about from an evolutionary pre-wiring that tends to bring us to trust without inquiring more deeply into the reasons for the trust. We rely on authority, we rely on our belief in the validity and the charisma, in the veracity of the persons that we believe in that are telling us about reality. In fact, we are relying on the groupthink, on the ideas that are perpetuated within the group into which we are born and into which we grow, and which civilize us so that we become a person within that interpersonal space. So this shift from a pre-wiring that is always with us, that tends to trust without going into the intricacies of that trust, and how that pre-wiring gave rise to an institution that, even though it is obvious to all that it is not an institution that is based on any value beyond the inquisitiveness and the critique of peers, one of the other, i.e. the entire scientific establishment, how that became the very focus of our trust to such an extent that it cuts across all cultures. So this talk, chapter 12 in this series, will continue to look at Chapin's book, The Life of Science, or the Scientific Life, in order to see how this turning point came about, how the idea of the individual scientist as a seeker of truth and therefore trustworthy has been replaced by the institutions of science that yield truth on a professional basis and are supported by funds, by states, by an entire establishment that has become internationally widespread. Academia in all countries is constantly on the rise. And to become a member of the elite of humanity, of the elite of each nation's civilization, one must undergo advanced training in academia. Whatever your discipline, this has become the initiation rite of adulthood into the family of humanity, into pan-human civilization. This goes through learning how to use academic tools, having working knowledge of English as a lingua franca. This cuts across all civilizations. So this shift from professional truth producers who are not considered to be individually as holders of any truth. In fact, there is a lot of suspicion sometimes directed towards individual scientists. Are they conforming to the rules? Are they truly eliciting materials that are true to reality? And there is constant peer review of these matters. But as an institution, the disciplines of science have become the true bastions of truth in our civilization beyond whatever other beliefs one may subscribe to on a personal level. Because whether you are a Buddhist, a Hinduist, a Jew, a Sufi, an atheist, a new atheist, whatever you are, whatever else you are, you can accept the findings of technoscience as they emerge from the institutions of science and take them into your world. It crosses all these cultural boundaries. So let us turn now to more quotations from Chapin as we go through his book, The Scientific Life, which describes this transition from science as a vocation, as it were, to big science. And ultimately, he will show us how scientists fit into this, actual scientists fit into this new vision or new creation of what is, new description of the reality of the scientific endeavor. So looking at Chapin on page 29, he discusses the shift, the transition in science from the endeavor of single individuals thinking about reality. And I think the classic example would be Einstein writing out formulas on a napkin in a restaurant, or working in the patents office writing out his stuff as an amateur interested in interested in various ideas of mathematics and the way that non-Euclidean mathematics may be applied to the issues of the day. Very romantic conception, very similar to other conceptions of artists. Like we have the famous J.K. Rowling sitting on a napkin and writing the prophecies for the 7 volumes of Harry Potter. So this is the conception of the artist as someone who in his own mind gets at eternal truth or whatever. And this has been transformed. So I'm reading now from Chapin on page 29. If the philosopher was the person you turned to for answers to general questions, then the sciences now had a better answer. A collection of specialists bringing their expertise to bear on any intelligibly framed general questions. So this collectivity has become the center of the scientific endeavor. And as we described before, this collectivity is in fact, how shall we phrase it, a way to take the main mechanism of how humans operate, which is in a group, an intersubjective group, where everyone has the same representation of reality, and this is shared by the group, and take that and put that under the scrutiny of specialists. Or let's rephrase that. If every individual is always in a position to empirically evaluate the representations of truth that he or she receives intersubjectively, because whatever your elders or betters or peers or parents or whatever others tell you about reality, whatever your internal representation of reality is, ultimately you encounter reality all the time as a corroborating evidence for what you have in your mind. So if your parents tell you sunrise, sunset, if the scripture says sunrise, sunset, and you see a sunrise, sunset, then you have corroborated, confirmed that theory, that representation of reality. Now, this is a group thing, but always the individual is the one that takes the ideas that are held in his mind or her mind into the laboratory of reality. So in fact, it's always the individual facing reality, buttressed by the representations of the real, all the ideas, dogmas, ideals, thoughts in the individual's mind. Now, the rise of science involved, in fact, a sort of expansion of this empirical I, of this empirical individual, now expanded to a group of individuals, all occupying that position in which they look to reality to confirm or disconfirm their ideas. Now, the twist here is that, as we saw in the Ash experiments, an individual may see something, but give precedence, give a priority to the perceived vision of reality. The real always takes second place to what we believe is the real as pictured to us by inter-subjectivity through others, what they tell us about the real. Usually the two pictures coincide, so we really have no problem living within reality, within the ideas that we gain from our civilization, our particular culture or group. Sometimes, especially after the rise of science, they do clash. For example, the classic scriptures between the cosmological description that science provides and the description within scripture. Sunrise, sunset, what set, what rise, sun revolving around the galaxy, and the galaxy revolving around the cosmos, and the earth revolving around the sun that revolves around the galaxy, and all at stunning speeds that would boggle our minds had we not been on board. So when you're on board the train, you don't feel the motion unless you look out the window. So science is our looking out the window and realizing, oh my God, we are at such tremendous speed. But actually, there is usually the worldview and the view that the individual empirically experiences are not at odds. Now, but still, it's there. All the time, the individual within reality meets empirical reality, and what he or she knows about reality underlies everything that the individual experiences. Now, take this individual experience and take it up a notch and have a collection of individuals constantly inspecting the empirical to see if they can update their vision, update their theory, their conjectures, their dogmas, ultimately dogmas, but at first conjectures regarding reality. And this is the great innovation of science. While the individual is always embedded in the real, but takes everything else on belief and authority, now we have a group which creates new authority facing the real, directed at the real. This is the turn to the real. So, in fact, that group of specialists, this very place of science where there is always doubt about what are we really seeing? Is our theory really applicable to this reality? This is the innovation, and it is a group innovation. It is a group think. It is a collection of specialists bringing their expertise to bear on any intelligibly framed general question. So we are asking things about reality and letting people who specialize in aspects of it answer. But reality is the ultimate criterion. How did the disciplines of physics, chemistry, biology come about? Before, it was all part of natural philosophy. But as people revealed, these groups working together to look at reality, revealed deeper and deeper aspects of reality, greater and greater depth of reality, the knowledge increased exponentially so that one group could no longer focus on just one subject. And the disciplines began diverging. And today, of course, they are so divergent that it takes something like 20 years to become a specialist in even the most specific area of some of the disciplines. So, in fact, this turn to the real created an institution of plurality, a collection of specialists that create the knowledge that is taken on trust as authoritative by the rest of the human population of the globe. And this is the great innovation. So no longer one person holding truth, but a collection of specialists who work out what they believe to be true, and this becomes the truth adopted by the rest of the population who have no tools to actually look into the problem. So it's like a new focus, a new institution for creating trusted knowledge that has thereby been created, and it works through the usual ways that humans work, in groups, in representations of reality. But here, because the turn to the real is of the essence here, then everything is always examined again and again to see if it really is a description of reality. And finally, ultimately, the group authority creates the dogma, says, okay, so this is our present conception of the real. And this is dogma towards the outside of the discipline. For those who are outside of science, who are outside of specific disciplines, for all of us, in fact, because every single individual can only specialize in one area of life, then the rest is taken on faith, but that faith is very deep because we understand that it is based on the inter-subjectivity of all those specialists, all those persons versed in the art that now reach a consensus or a majority vote on a certain theory of reality. And of course, science is associated with technology, so we also create new vistas of the real in actual reality or in virtual reality, that's also new vistas, through this consensus or majority vote of the collectivity. Okay, let's move ahead in shaping. So moving on to page 41, 42 in shaping. This is some really interesting stuff that he compares the vision of science before modernity, before our time, and how it was in the 19th century. So he's saying first, the integration of science into structures of power and profit were never more than partial in the 19th century. So in fact, in our age, science has become integrated into power and profit. And we will have to analyze that in future talks. What are these power of profit? What's in it? And of course, science is integrated in so many ways, in the military, in industry, and so on. But here, it's very interesting to see, and there's some really nice anecdotes about some of the scientific dilettantes, actually the pristine intellectuals. Today, there are, it's like you're saying, it's like, wow, how could that have been at a time, at a pre-specialization time, that a person non-affiliated with a discipline can make a discipline for himself, and this is really it's more like an artist. But okay, let's look into shaping directly. And he writes, the most famous scientist of the century was a gentleman amateur, Charles Darwin. Yes, the great Charles Darwin, whom I hold to be one of the great miracles of the modern age, the person who simply showed us, revealed to us the inner structure of reality, Charles Darwin, okay, I'm going back to Shaping. I'm reading directly from his text. Charles Darwin was never employed to produce scientific knowledge, nor was the knowledge he then produced designed to be of use to contemporary structures of power and profit. On the Beagle, Darwin was the captain's guest on the Admiralty books for food, although he paid an extra sum for the captain's table. Far from receiving a remuneration, this is amazing stuff. The total cost of the voyage to Darwin's father was £1,200. So you see, this is the wonders of history. You go into the personal workings of of a person who brought such amazing light, such a Prometheus of human knowledge, Darwin, and actually he was dependent on his father for paying his pension on the voyage. He was like a tourist. Okay, so writes Shaping, in Britain alone, the list of amateur scientists in the late 18th and 19th century includes some of the most influential figures in all the sciences. While the cleric scientist did become a much rarer figure in the 19th century, the founder of genetics, Gregor Mendel, was a monk, and several British geologists were in holy orders in addition to holding academic posts. Much of the talk of the professionalization of science during the 19th century has been too crude. The increasing integration of science into the state and commerce did not simply turn science into a career, but the notion of science and that of career need to be spelled out. What both the state and the institutions of commerce wanted was expertise, and embodied expertise is what they bought in and supported. So in fact, the individual intellectual working out truth was already turning to the real. But like Galileo himself, who relied on the patronage of the Medici family to support him as he thought out all of his ideas and conducted all of his experiments, it was not yet institutionalized in a group think. But ultimately, it is the group expertise, the people working together to look closer and closer into segments of reality that became the very heart of the scientific endeavor that became an institution supported by the state, by money, and so on and so on. So modern science actually emerges from this sort of individuals doing science. But again, let us not mistake here something that lies between the lines here, because Shaping does not emphasize this, but this is what happened. How come that Darwin, this intellectual, this gentleman amateur looking at nature, how did he become the founder of modern evolutionary thought and all these ideas that now influence everything we do in biology and genetics and so on, and the way we look at the world? And of course, this very series of lectures about the theology of evolution has so much to thank Darwin for. How did it come about? It did not come about, this transformation, because Darwin changed his mind. Darwin can change his mind. Darwin can talk as much as he wants about evolution, and nobody is supposed to buy it. And even today, all the creationists, they don't buy it. They don't listen to Darwin. They are not interested in Darwin, even though the entire science establishment works according to Darwin, and all laboratories acknowledge, all biological laboratories acknowledge the power of the theory of evolution. It is rejected by many religious people who say, no, it's all in the mind. So how did it come about, this transformation? The transformation occurred when people accepted Darwin's theory. When this theory became a representation of the real in the minds of an ever-expanding group of people, then did it become tangible. Now, theories have that ability. All dogma even dogma that we now completely reject, for example, the racist dogma of the Nazi era, at the time when so many people held that dogma, it became real for them. And for them, this was the representation of reality. So always it is the group, it is the wider consensus, the wider majority opinion of human groups that ultimately lead to what we believe and what we see as true, and this guides society in the way that it behaves. It can guide it into a dead end. It can guide it into the horror of the Holocaust, the horror of Stalin's totalitarian regime. It can create terrible things, but that's the way it works. You can't avoid that. So the turn in science, even before it became funded, was already coming through in that a lot of people subscribed to these opinions. People accepted Darwin theory, accepted Gregor Mendel's vision of genetics, and this became a guiding rule in handling the real. Many people took Darwin's conclusions and created interesting experiments that show that Darwin was right. Whether all those laboratory experiments with generations of animals, the famous Drosophila, the famous fly that so much is known about, and ultimately in genetics, everything in genetics has been wedded to evolutionary thought. This has become the basis of more and more consensus among specialists as to what the real is. And this is the true confirmation of Darwin's ideas, not that Darwin thought this or the other, not the fact that he was a gentleman, not supported by any institution, but by his dad. And today, maybe that dad would have sent him to study biology, and he would have innovated after gaining a lot more knowledge. But this is also one thing that you can't really compare the 19th century to the 21st century, because we know a lot more. And one person can't hold it all. When Darwin came into his own, doing his stuff, it was him working almost alone. He also had precedents. He had the Lyell. He had some geological ideas before. There were other people who were thinking of evolution, of reality in evolutionary terms, and he had that backdrop. And then he faced reality, and he counted those, the thrushes, his famous Galapagos researchers. And that was amazing on the Beagle, and he sent everything back to England, and he sorted through it, classified it, and did an amazing job and reached his theories, his conclusions on the basis of all these empirical evidences. But since Darwin's days, this has been replicated millions of times in millions of laboratories and millions of people, and has been corroborated through so many more experiments, direct on-hand experiments in evolution, inspired by Darwin. And there is so much more knowledge. Just genetics, that all the world of genetics, the exploding knowledge. It's just in '65 that the double helix was first thought about, and the famous Rosalind and Crick and Watson, and it was just 1965. This is after World War II. Almost everything crucial in the current era, the current revolutionary era, came about after World War II, including genetics. Only in the year 2000, that's just 19 years ago from the present day, less than a generation, if you count generations like 25 years, the first human genome was mapped. And this is ongoing. And this is the corroboration of Darwin's work. So it wasn't so today an individual going out into the world in order to find out, like Darwin did on the beagle, even if that individual has the good luck of having a parental support and funding, that individual has no way of encompassing all that has to be known before putting up a theory. Because when you put up a theory, you have to have all the facts, all the relevant facts for that area of endeavor. Now, we know a lot more beyond Darwin. We know so much about evolution now. So Darwin has been corroborated again and again, and also in many ways refuted. Many ways in our lectures, in our series of talks, we see how the interpretation of Darwin of reality misses some of the main points, especially, as we said, survival of the sweetest. Although that can be read among the lines, between the lines in Darwin's work, even though if not in later evolutionary thinkers like Spencer and so on, who created all these crazy evolutionary ideas of race, which go against the grain, because evolution is so fluid that where would you get a race? All races are intermingling. All races are intercompatible. The whole conception of race is ridiculous in the face of evolution. But still, people had these crazy ideas that they gained from Darwin, and these were refuted by the real. So going back to what we are discussing here, even when those gentlemen entrepreneurs were working in the 19th century outside any institutional mode, they were already creating within an institutional mode, because those who had to accept them to verify their findings were already working in a modus of groupthink, of group of specialists. In Darwin's days, his findings could still be published in the general press, although even in those days, I think his great treatise on barnacles was not really something that became very popular. It's because of the revolutionary nature of the implications of his ideas that he became so central. Not because of his science, but because ultimately he reflected on our perception of the real in such a deep way that cuts across all cultures. But the important thing is, what we see here is that ultimately science and the way that truth is produced has undergone a shift in which it is not only the opinion of singular scientists now being accepted by the general public, but rather the opinions of groups and the products, not just the opinions, because there's so much technoscience, the products of groups of people working in specific disciplines. They're working together ultimately produces the truth that are accepted by general society as the basis for the perception of the real. All right, let's make some progress here in shaping. Let's go forward and see what else we have here. We marked out here on page 43. There's a nice quotation from Tocqueville. So in the United States, Tocqueville observed a deep democratically rooted disinclination to support, so to speak, science for its own sake. In America, wrote Tocqueville, the purely practical part of science is admirably understood, and careful attention is paid to the theoretical portion, which is immediately requisite to application. In this respect, the Americans carry to excess a tendency that is, I think, discernible, though in a less degree, among all democratic nations. In aristocratic ages, science is more particularly called upon to furnish gratification to the mind. In democracies, to the body. Okay, that's real nice quotation from Tocqueville. But beyond that, in aristocratic ages, it is the particular charisma and virtue of the aristocrats, whether they be conoscenti or priests or holy men or esteemed leaders and so on, this gives credence to authority. So beyond Tocqueville, because I think this distinction is quite ridiculous, but it does illuminate the point that in democracy, what moves is the real. When we talk about the body, what is this body that he speaks of? This is the real, the tangibility of how people live, of how they operate, what they need, what their needs are, what their aspirations are. While the mind, this is the dogma part, the great truth. Who creates great truth? So in democracies, ultimately, since authority is removed from individuals, it becomes deposited in the groups that create these truth. This is part of what doing science as a group entails. This is the core of what scientific specialization means. So where before it was the idea of science, when it emerged, was as part of the general intellectual flowering of a single person, the Renaissance man who has a Da Vinci, who has so many pursuits, and some of them also create innovations in science and technology. Today, everything has been specialized, compartmentalized, for the very sheer reason that there is so much of it, and that as human beings we like to know what other human beings thought before us. So you're always building, as we said, dwarves on the shoulder of dwarves, as it were, or giants on the shoulders of giants, depending on your perspective. Then ultimately it has become a different prospect in which we derived truth, again, as we said, from a group endeavor specializing in certain areas of truth and recognizing that no single person can ever encompass the whole, so that, in fact, the single person, the individual, is still accepting everything on face as dogma, like it was, as it was before, so it will ever be. But the core producers, the source of this knowledge embedded now as the dogma taken on trust has changed, and it has become this group of peers, of specialists versed in the art that oversee each other. Okay, moving on to another bit of shaping. This is on page, what page is it? 46. He quotes from Weber about the way that the scientist is no longer a priest or a prophet. And Weber writes, "It is not the gift of grace of seers and prophets dispensing sacred values and revelations, nor does it partake of the contemplation of sages and philosophers about the meaning of the universe. This, to be sure, is the inescapable condition of our historical situation. We cannot evade it so long as we remain true to ourselves." So, in fact, the scientist is relegated to the realm of the real and does not pontificate on the deeper matters of creation. But of course, as we are doing in these series of talks, we can now co-opt some of both the development of science and some of its ideas into a new variety of idea, a new paradigm regarding the real. But this is not what science is about, obviously. Obviously, within the disciplines of science and academia, the entire enterprise, the entire project of these talks is lies beyond the pale, because it generalizes, it attempts to draw conclusions and present a theology that goes beyond the parameters of science. So actually it is again left to the minds of laymen, of all of us who outside our specialization, to see to what extent this belief makes sense to us in the very in the same sense that we examine any other belief, whether theistic or atheistic or whatever worldview one subscribes to, that generalizes for us what we perceive as the real. So this lies outside science. Science has become a crucible for working out truth in very specific disciplines. Or as Shapin writes, at the beginning of the 20th century, the identity of the scientist was radically unstable. To be a scientist was still something of a calling, but it was becoming something of a job. It was still associated with the idea of social disengagement, but increasingly recognized as a source of civically valued power and wealth. It was still associated with the notion of special personal virtue, but it was on the cusp of moral ordinariness. Chapter 3 takes up the story of how the idea of the morally ordinary scientist became a 20th century cultural institution and what work that idea did in the culture. So actually this is exactly what we are examining here, the place of science in our vision of the world, in our trust of representations of the real. And in fact, all of us are in that position that we are disengaged from the specialization of science, and each and every one of us is trying to figure out the truth about reality. It is to this place where every individual is located within the parameters of the real as they are represented through civilization, that all theoretical, theological, philosophical, psychological, etc. work, all suggested dogmas appeal to or are focused at. We are talking here about a sort of meta theory that can help individuals look at reality and make sense of it as individuals, qua individuals. But this lies outside the pale of science. There is no scientific way, or as far as I know, there is no scientific way to confirm or refute the conjectures presented here as a theology of the real, of progress and perfection. But for me, it makes sense, and it can make sense, I think, to a lot of people because it encompasses all that we presently know as laymen. It cannot go into the resolutions of science, but at the moment, the resolutions of science confirm this theory, or rather do not disconfirm it, because it is a theory that is based on what we know of the real at the moment. But it is not a scientific theory, because it is not a group of people working together to decide that this is the best representation of the real, and thereby creating all the products and objects of and theories of science. But ultimately, every single one of us, since science has become so specialized, every one of us is a layman. And we are now at a point of history where our meta-theories go through this disenchantment that led to the rise of science that we cannot let go of, because this is the revealed real. So in a way, the way that we are configuring this theory is to try and figure out how we, as laymen who are not privy to who can never be privy, that this is structurally impossible to the workings of every scientific laboratory, to the way that truth is derived in science, how we can make sense of it all within a greater theological framework. So indeed, to conclude our perusal of Shapin on page 76, let us conclude with this main idea of where we as individuals face reality and what science is for us. So I'm reading from page 76. He is quoting from Oppenheimer, who claimed that the life of science did inspire some homely virtues, a degree of humility, tolerance, and integrity. But that is all. No moral heroes here. And so Oppenheimer concluded, in this field, quite ordinary men, using what are in the last analysis only the tools which are generally available in our society, manage to unfold for themselves and all others who wish to learn the rich story of one aspect of the physical world and of man's experience. And then he quotes from Jacques Ellul, who wrote, "We are forced to conclude that our scientists are incapable of any but the emptiest platitudes when they stray from their specialties." Okay, so here I added this box and I wrote, so the burden of how to live one's life is thrust back on the individual, who must find his or her own biographical solutions to the systemic problems in which we are enmeshed. Even if you choose flight to tradition, even if you choose, for example, to eschew science, to take on creationism, to become a devout Muslim, Christian, Jew, Hindu, whatever your creed, whatever tradition you decide to flee to as a bastion of certainty, yet it is a modern choice of a person who can choose whatever path he or she chooses, including carving out a new path, because we now live in a world where there are these pockets of specialization that are revealing the real to us. And if we go back to our basic ideal or idea, let me put this on, our believing the real, the belief in progress and perfection that we now see is mediated by our trust as individuals in majority opinions about the ideal, i.e. we have the institutions of science and academia and technology to create for us these elements in which we trust. And that trust is our mediation to our various interfaces with the real. So we are living in a world that has science in it, a world that is capable of indeed crushing idols, dethroning kings, shattering markets, whenever there is a distrust of these based on what we trust in other areas. So the trust and distrust of the many, that is the main focus here. And every individual is in that situation. No one is spared this conundrum. So even if you do ultimately opt to go for traditions where authority resides, where charisma resides, where revelation is accepted and so on, you cannot get out of the real world that you live in, the real that is being exposed by science. And of course, if you subscribe to the same theology that I am espousing here, in which the real unfolds the divine, in which the entire progress of what we see is an unfolding of divinity, then obviously it makes a lot of sense, and you can then take parts of the real as you encounter them and see how they combine into your own creative equation of what you are going to do with your life in that reality. So now I think I more or less took what I could from Chapin. I recommend his book about the scientific life as a very interesting reading. Many anecdotes about scientists, a lot of quotations. It's almost journalistic in its trend. It's fun reading it, as you saw all the little anecdotes about Darwin that I quoted and so on. And I think you already understand the main thrust. He proves his case. I believe that this is an interesting book to peruse. But let's now go back to our main idea of how science is integrated with our basic inability to know, our basic ignorance about reality. And I've drawn up a few neologisms that I will now show you in thinking about this. Okay, so to conclude our discussion of this aspect of believing the real, I've drummed up a few neologisms that encapsulate some of these ideas that we've been talking about, and I will try to summarize them for you here in conclusion of our reading of Shaping and the Rise of Group Science. So, the first one is, you will never know the mysteries. That is the basic place of the individual in modern society, in modern civilization. You will never know the intricacies of any specific discipline beyond the one that you specialize in. So that is like Yo-Nok Tem. I thought when one says Yo-Nok Tem, it means you'll never know the mysteries. Okay, it's like acronyms for these ideas. And that is also a PSI, systemic ignorance. You are forever ignorant. There is no way that you will know the whole truth about the real. And now, where in the past we knew we don't know the whole truth, but we thought some people of charisma or revelation did hold the whole truth, as it were, and were therefore infallible. Today we are much more skeptical when we have a tool for working out things in specific areas. Okay, and the next one, another one is a FIOTI. That's fundamental ignorance of the individual. So that's the other side of the psi. So when we say that everyone is a FIOTI, that we are fundamentally ignorant, everything we take on trust. There's no escape. It's that's why I have the blue pill and the red pill, because this idea of what the real is and what the imagined is, that is at the very core of our existence, because everything is represented in our mind. Everything is imagined, including our visions of the real. And we encounter the real through our imaginations, but these are now based on the conclusions of scientific groups and that also lie beyond our knowledge. Okay. Because TISWOORIOM, we live in a TISWOORIOM. What is a TISWOORIOM? The intersubjective world of others represented in our minds. So every single individual lives in a TISWOORIOM. I think that's the best knowledgism up to this point. It's like it was brilling and the slightly like Jabberwocky stuff. The slightly toves did Geir and Gimble in the Wab. So we all live in a TISWOORIOM. And the TISWOORIOM is the intersubjective world of others represented in our minds. So this group consensus, what we think that others believe in, and they together with us through language, through knowledge, and everything that we live in, they create our world, and in which we are partners, in which we participate. Because OGSECK, only a group sharing experience can know anything about the real. Because if I see something, I may be dreaming. This is the classic Cartesian problem. Yeah? The dreaming, the demons, whatever, all these hallucinations of Descartes. But when two or three or hundreds or whole institutions of people are seeing the same thing, then we have corroboration of it. Then we tend to believe in it. Of course, you can refute it because philosophically, logically, it doesn't matter. 1 million people can err and have erred. ideas were held by all of humanity that have been proven not only not reflective of reality, but also quite destructive. But ultimately, the real wakes us up. Ultimately, when we meet better explanations of reality, or when reality rudely awakens us from great ideologies, then we change our minds. And again, it is a group change of mind. It is not just an individual. Or rather, the individual adopts those group thinks that ultimately seem to each one of us the best in our situation in life. And we see throughout history that certain ideas become more and more salient. Now everyone accepts the fact, for example, that the earth revolves around the sun. Almost everyone. I know there are few. I read something by one fundamentalist in the Bible Belt has this fantastic explanation that says actually that the sun revolves around us. And actually, according to Einsteinian theory, yeah, okay, everything is relative depending where you're standing. If you're standing on the sun or you're standing on the earth and so on, depends on your point of view. But actually, we have a worldview of dynamic cosmos that goes far beyond what you can see by gazing at a sunrise or sunset. And we all accept that now, most of us. Okay, here's a big one. OAVaL go BoMo kae hero TEOTeR. Yeah, this is real geek speak. It's almost Klingon, right? So what does this mean? This is only a very large group of blind men can achieve ever higher resolutions of the elephant of the real. The parable of the elephant and the blind man. I've now described the parable, but let me say this Klingonese, these geekies once more. This geeky neologism. OAVaL go BoMo kae hero TEOTeR. Yes, very large group. So, while the usual perspective that wants to subsume the whole truth in a single individual views the parable of the element of the parable of the elephant and the blind man as showing bias, as limited knowledge, and even as proof that only religion can supply the answer because God knows. And let me show you some pictures of the usual way this is interpreted. Blind men and the elephant, how our limited knowledge leads us to believe it to be the whole truth. The parable in a nutshell, there's an elephant but 6 blind men are filling it up. And they have to report what they see, what they perceive. And each one sees a different part of the elephant and therefore perceives only a segment of reality. So one holds the tail, he says the elephant is like a snake. One holds the trunk, he says it's like a rope. One holds the tusk, he says it's like whatever. I have it here. It's a hose, it's a sword, it's a fan, it's a wall, it's a tree, it's a rope, and so on and so on. Everyone has his own limited perception. And this is the classic story of bias. They can't see, they're blind, so they mistake the elephant for all kinds of things. And this is like a parable. This reminds us of what we spoke of about Plato. Everyone's in the cave, all we see are shadows. Nobody sees the full sun, nobody sees the true elephant. So this is like the limitations of human perception. But the blind man, just one more word before I take this in a completely different direction. Some people say that this is that only revelation can solve this. So it's like these blind men, each one sees something partial, but Jesus, I took this from, I think it's an evangelical website, Jesus sees it's an elephant. Only the external view of God can see what it is. But of course, we do not hold a Jesus view of theology, a Jesusian view of theology, but rather an evolutionary view of theology. And the question is, what happens if you have a lot more blind men? So let's take this to another direction. In fact, if you brought out not 600, not 6, but hundreds of blind men, thousands, then tens of thousands, as commonly happens today in academia across the globe. And this is everything that we discussed about science can be surmised in this parable, because there are so many people feeling around reality and corroborating their evidence, then you would eventually get a very clear picture of the elephant on human terms. You don't need God for that. The ever-increasing resolution of the approximation of perfection through progress. Because just, okay, so I have this picture here of resolution of the elephant, you see? So at first I took a picture of an elephant, and then I took down, say this is like 10 blind men. So this is what they describe. It's something very unclear. Then if we go on, we see, let's see if I can mark it out. No, I can't. Okay, so I'm looking at it from left to right, and we have first elephant, and then we have like 1,000 blind men filling in, and then 10,000, then 100,000, then 1,000,000, and slowly the resolution grows as experience is pooled. In fact, reality emerges from the spotlight of many minds, from the perception of a multitude of persons who, comparing notes, reach conclusions that no single individual working alone can muster. Indeed, we can now rephrase the classic aphorism about dwarves standing on the shoulders of giants as dwarves standing on the shoulders of a multitude of other dwarves. Or to paraphrase the famous adage on turtles, sorry madam, it's dwarves all the way down. But a multitude of dwarves can easily outrank the height of a single giant. So in fact, this whole scientific enterprise of specialization, this offsets the systemic ignorance. If we go back to our neologisms above, then the OAVaL go BoMo kai TEOTeR, that only a very group of blind men can achieve ever higher resolutions of the elephant of the real, thereby dispelling our FIOTI, fundamental ignorance of the individual. Because even though each and every blind man and each and every scientist operates under FIOTI, ultimately, when we get to a group, then OGSECK, then a large group sharing experience can know. We can ultimately reach the very resolution of the elephant, here portrayed by the external instrument of the Deus Ex Machina of Jesus, saying it's an elephant. We, from our position of ignorance, through the progress, through evolutionary development of our visions of the real, comparing notes, comparing ignorance, slowly reach a greater and greater resolution of the elephant of the real. Here I'm using the elephant as a parable for all of reality. So we, since we are all blind men and doomed to ignorance, still we can have a vision of reality that is slowly unfolding as more and more blind men feel different parts of the elephant. Moreover, we now have groups of blind men. Consider each blind man to be a group of blind men specializing in the elephant's particular member that they are feeling up. So if someone took the leg, for example, then some would specialize in skin texture, some would specialize in the stability of the leg, some would specialize in the connective tissue connecting the leg to the trunk, and so on and so on. And all these groups would be founding around and getting a better and better resolution. So ultimately, even though we do not have a Deus Ex Machina, we do not have some external revelation telling us about the real, we get a better and better approximation of the real through our scientific endeavors. And how far is our vision of the real from our sensory experience? If you just Einstein, quantum mechanics, genetics, how far is this from our direct perception of reality? So our visions of the real are embedded so much in new beliefs about the way the world is. And of course, from our theological perspective, this is the divine revealing itself to itself, as it were. It's the growing perfection of the cosmos as that divinely enfolding increased perfection. Okay, so I think this more or less sums up. I have a few more neologisms before we finish this segment. One is CEI, the civilized embedded I. So floating in a sea of civilization, our I is like the ancient yogic idea of the unity of all, so that the ego is a jar full of water floating on an ocean of water. Break the jar and it is just water in water. This is from Thoughts About Yoga, Life and Death by Gerda from Windham on page 60. I took that quotation out of there. Although you encountered this idea in other yogic texts, this was what came up when I Googled it. So our personal mind floats in the great ocean of humanity's mind, which underlies all our own humanity. So everything that we have, that we accept on trust, is the pre-wiring, the under foundation, the understructure, or infrastructure actually, of our personalities. And the science disciplines may be described as ook, another piece of not Klingonese. How did I describe this? Not Klingonese, but geekies. So another piece of geekies, the ook. The ook is organs of knowledge. So within the great body of humanity, the various disciplines of science create specialized organs. Each discipline is an organ that derive knowledge. It is as if our blind men have set up groups specializing in the various parts of the elephant, as well as interdisciplinary groups that specialize in the interfaces between parts, in the same way that our originally undifferentiated cells eventually differentiate into unique specializations. So again, if we take the parable of the shift from cellular to from single cellular to multicellular life, we are now shifting in humanity from a single ignorance of the individual to the huge organs of ignorant individuals working together in disciplines to derive truth and, of course, change reality through technology. Okay, a few more. Yeah, I'm a bit overloading this because each one merits a longer discussion, but it's a good summary of what we did up until now, and it can be a springboard for our next talk. So I'm going to go through all these neologisms. So then the next one was oismu or oikmu. Ordinary individuals can make up OOK. So all cells were once stem cells. They could go in any direction, but then they specialized. Each and every individual can be a chemist or a bookbinder or a ballet dancer or anything, but one can only go down the path of a limited number of specializations as an individual. The rest we leave to our fellow humans, and again, it is our belief in intersubjectivity. And I've already forgotten my better neologism, but I think it was OGSECK. Yeah, so it's only OGSECK because we live in a TISWOORIOM. So since we live in a TISWOORIOM, it is only OGSECK that can allow us to know reality, or through that we know reality. So to complete our idea of how the rise of science and specialization becomes embedded within the greater fabric of humanity, let's take our last neologism, ethot, and everything is taken on trust. From the point of view of the individual, you cannot avoid it. You must trust. trust is the extracellular fluid of human civilization. Just as extracellular fluid is the internal environment of all multicellular animals, so trust is the ECF of humanity. And with the rise of science, our vision has shifted on this basis. And we no longer trust talented, authoritative, powerful, holy individuals, or we trust them in their own specialization. But there is a greater power than that. It is trust itself, the trust of groups, the majority opinion that pulls the reality verdicts of individuals into an intersubjective vision of the truth, ever improving approximations of elephants. This is the basis of modernity. The deep structural ignorance, the inability to know of every single individual, the necessity to rely on trust has not changed, but that trust is no longer validated through charisma, power, holiness, etc., but through the majority opinion of specialists. Laymen, and we are all laymen, do not have the tools to know, but they can structure their trust on the majority opinion of most denizens of this planet, i.e., that the majority opinions of specialists working in dedicated disciplines is to be trusted, because they are so organized as to constantly ferret out untruth, constantly watching their peers like hawks, and constantly cooperating to arrive at conclusions that are acceptable to all those versed in the art, and subsequently acceptable to all other humans who take such conclusions on trust. So trust is the center of everything that we do as humans. It is the interstitial extracellular fluid that unites us all as human beings, and it is and its many levels are what constitutes our ability to progress as humanity and create a better and better environment for all human beings. And we will, in our next talk, we will discuss additional aspects of trust beyond science, in particular the aspect of money, which is also taken on trust. So we will have some insights on that in our future talks. You are invited to join. Be well.